Unsubani.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share with you today something that I think you'll find useful. I hope you'll find useful. If we can just go to the presentation. So what I have decided to do in the context of some of the conversation of framing yesterday is to start talking about something that is really, really important and happening in our context in our world. And I thought that it might be useful for us as communicators, brand activists, and business influencers to have a conversation about. And the topic that I've chosen to speak about today is the question around leader versus challenger brands. This is a reality that is happening around the world and on the continent, where we've got brands that are strong, have had presence in markets and dominated categories and industries for a long time, being disrupted by new, young, emerging challenges. And certainly this is happening around the world and on this beautiful continent of ours. And I thought that this might be a useful conversation for us to really apply our minds and to start thinking about with respect to leader versus challenger brands, and ultimately, based on what we are seeing, who do we think will win this battle for market share, for customers, and for share of countries? But I also want to set out the context that says that the word brand is a proxy, not just for companies and brands, it's a proxy for the continent. We're a brand as a continent, challenging and trying to get our share of voice on the global stage. It's a proxy for us as communicators. It's a proxy for some of the discussions that we had yesterday about new media, existing media, what platforms do we have to communicate? It's a proxy for donors and people that are looking for donor investment and donor funding. They're up against challenges and leaders on a global context. So I think this is quite a useful conversation for us to have, because there are some really specific insights that impact us as communicators, brand activists, and business influencers. And so the starting point is then to define what are leaders and what are challengers. And typically, leaders are brands or businesses that have a dominant market share in specific categories and specific industries. They have a strong history and heritage, have spent a lot of time and investment building those categories and those industries. Strong brand heritage, and also lots of scale and trust. And I use the word trust in inverted commas because I'll talk about the concept of old trust versus new trust in a moment. So those are leader brands, and we know globally, you'll identify some of the brands that you're seeing on screen, brands that are leaders, that have been in market, have grown industries, have developed value chains, and are really, really growing their businesses multiple-fold. And even on the continent, Tebe talked yesterday about the most valuable brands on the continent. And certainly there are brands that are leaders, clear leaders, with strong value propositions, strong dominance in those markets, and really making a difference and impact in society, countries, and the continent at large. And so that really is the landscape of what we call the leader brands. And I can talk a lot more about leader brands. But the reality is that there is the rise of challenger brands. And challenger brands are coming fast and hard. And challenger brands, by their very nature, are brands that are there to challenge the status quo, to find opportunities that actually have been, they see confines in current industries, current categories, and they're redefining the rules of categories, industries. And what is also interesting is challenger brands have a unique point of view, and they take strong leadership positions on things they fundamentally believe in. And their purpose is to challenge and disrupt convention. And I've listed a couple there. So Dove wants to disrupt the whole thing about beauty. If you think about Netflix, they wanted to disrupt. So the whole thing is about, and their mindset and their outlook is that current industries, current categories, there's a level of unfairness. And their role is to help drive innovation and serve customers better through that piece.
We definitely thought of ourselves as a challenger brand, as sort of outsiders that were taking a fresh look at an industry that we felt needed massive change.
If you're not willing to stand up to the big boys and show a different way, I don't know, you just get lost, I guess.
There's a very rigid segmentation. This is a rum, this is a whiskey.
Can you get volume?
And I found it very easy to go in and just mess with that because no one had.
No one thought, anyone in the world would go and stay with someone in their home. That it was such a, a scary idea.
Can we get volume, please?
We proved it actually, it's not a scary idea. It's something that people want to be doing.
You're supposed to perceive the brand the same way wherever you meet them. But here we wanted to do something different.
We're here to transform this industry. We aren't necessarily here just to sell glasses online.
To make other people as passionate about great craft beer as we are.
To improve children's lives through developing healthy relationships with food.
We're going to go and try and get 400 people their jobs back.
We think it's a competitive advantage to spend less, force you to be smarter, force you to innovate.
We're very happy to steal ideas from anywhere that we can.
The big foot on the pack, we've run that in The Guardian. Haven't we run that in The Guardian? There's some very political statements, and brands don't do that.
We said, if you don't publish these ads as is, we will go to press.
We've really focused on doing kind of edgy, slightly provocative PR, but they've all been done because it gives us a platform to get our ideas across about beer.
So what you see there are challenger brands that have gone into specific categories and industries with a real purpose to gain market share and to defy conventions. And the most interesting thing about challenger brands is that they don't have the legacy and all the cultural and structural and IT complexity that long-established leader brands have, and they're a lot more agile. They're making decisions at pace and at scale, and certainly at the center of it is this massive thing around a cause and a purpose that really drives what they do. And so what you're starting to see is that leader brands typically are about maintaining the status quo within the category and really trying to drive that because that's where they've been strong traditionally and that's where they've made their muscle. And what you see is challenger brands are really about progressing the category and really disrupting the category and moving and changing behavior. So if you think about Netflix, if you think about Uber, if you think about Airbnb, at its core is also about fundamentally changing consumer behavior. And a real tension then starts to happen because what do leader brands do in the context of this evolving change, evolving disruption, and these blurred lines between traditional business and the new world? And so what you start to see is that a lot of leader brands also start to get involved in supporting legislation and regulation that protects the very category where they dominate, because they can see the threat of all of these new and emerging challenger brands that are coming. And absolutely challenger brands are stealing market share and driving growth. And if you look at trends globally, $22 billion worth of value has moved from leader brands to challenger brands. What you also see, and this chart shows the venture capitalists funding and investment has increased triple-fold to brands that are challengers. And people are investing a lot of money, not just globally, but also on the continent, in young startup challenger brands in order to get higher returns because they absolutely see the value of those brands in terms of how they're driving forward. And it's not just in one industry, it's across multiple industries. All industries are being disrupted by the emergence of these young challengers. And there's just some examples of different firms and investment. And certainly the world has changed. A lot of things have changed. The disruption, technology, and what technology has done has been absolutely amazing. I always tell the story that I have an 11-year-old son, but when he was 2, we were at my parents' house, and a life-changing moment happened. The landline rang. And my son kind of heard the sound, and he kind of walked towards the landline. And I stood there looking at my son, looking at the landline, and I realized that he will never know what it was like to live in an era where we actually phoned a place, not a person. And these digital natives, the world has fundamentally changed. And we can see this. People don't trust brands. People trust peers. And so how we write our content, how we communicate, what we say, how we say it, is absolutely important. But it's not just about what we say. It's about actually doing versus telling. And that's what people want to see from brands. Research, and we talk about research because research is at the heart of it all. You can't come, I think there's a big debate happening about universal human truths and, Africa is not a country. And we've got to invest the time to understand the nuances, what customers want, what they're looking for, and really try to develop solutions that are built on what they want. There was a survey done across 5 countries on the continent about what the things that are most important to people across the continent. Number 1, family. Number 1. Number 2, God. And we see the rise of religion in all of our research and the amount of time people are spending in church across the board on the continent, an average of around 12 hours a week in church. Health. For those watching this, I always worry about where love kicks in terms of its relative importance, but that's another talk for another day. But research is absolutely important. We talked earlier on about the communications and the marketing profession. And there's a very wonderful book called The Business of Influence. And the book chapter 1 starts with what is the definition of marketing? And it goes on to say that the AA in the Association of Marketing in America defines it as this, the European Association defines it as that, and then it goes on to talk about all the various definitions of what marketing it is. It then says, what is the definition of PR? And it quotes about 5 different definitions of what PR. Then it says, what's the definition of communications? And then it goes, what's the relationship between all of these things? And then it ends with confused. And then it says, no wonder nobody takes us seriously, because we amongst ourselves can't even define what the definitions of these things are. And then he says, if I were an alien or somebody new who came onto the planet trying to understand brand, communications, PR, and I asked myself one simple question, what are we all trying to do? And he says, and that's the end of chapter 1, I would have to come to the conclusion that we are all in the business of influence. And the book is called The Business of Influence, and it's got a wonderful model that talks about the role that we play in helping to influence the market stakeholders, investors, analysts across the different stakeholder list. And I think this is so important because our role is about influence. But how do you track influence? How do you measure influence? And I think we've got to do a lot of work to make sure that we can really stay true to that. But the other point is business. Our role has to be seen as a strategic enabler of business. And the more we are shifting away from the link back to business and business metrics and business outcomes, I think we're really not doing ourselves justice. Because it is a difficult place and a difficult space for us as a community. And it's a little bit like, I always use the example, what is the measure of success of the CIA? And the measure of success of the CIA is when there's been no events. Because they've been intelligent, they've now thwarted all the different attacks and all the different plottings, but nothing has happened. And therefore people don't see the value because they haven't seen anything happen. And it's a little bit like that in terms of the role that we play. But we certainly have to bring that business perspective forward in a much more compelling way. The other great book is Rethinking Reputation, and it talks about how PR trumps marketing, advertising, PR, and we all know that you can have a 174-year-old business that is built, and in 5 seconds, that entire thing can tumble because of something that or someone has done in your business. So really great. But the question then is, are leader brands really, really on the ropes? When you look at traditional leaders, you look at the rise and emergence of challenger brands, are leader brands really, really in trouble? And I think a lot of the data suggests the opposite, which is actually big brands are actually getting bigger, making a hell of a lot more money. And even the new emerging now leader brands like Facebook, Apple, etc., are now becoming the first billion-dollar companies. So the research is suggesting that some of these leader brands who do specific things are actually getting bigger. And we can talk about why we think that's happening. But not all of the leader brands are. A lot of brands that have been leaders have actually seen their demise. And there's a lot of brands that we are seeing. I mean, if I just look on this list, traditional bookstores. In South Africa, we've got one called Exclusive Books. 33% down sales year on year. I'm not sure who still goes to Mr. Video anymore to hire videos. And certainly if people don't change and drive some of that change in their organizations, looking at the market, looking at the shifts in the market, we certainly are in trouble. And so the fundamental question then is who will win in this battle, as it were, between leader brands and challenger brands? And our point of view is that there is no right answer, but the one answer that we can say for sure is that the people and the brands that will win are brands that adopt a challenger mindset. So even if you're a brand that is like Old Mutual, 174 years old, you've got to start thinking like a challenger and start applying some of the principles of a challenger into your business. So we argue that it is absolutely about developing a challenger mindset. And that's where the value is over time. Because successful brands and businesses have to have this divine discontent. They talk about the All Blacks, the rugby team, and why they always win. And they talk about they have this thing called divine discontent. Even when they are winning, they go back, they review what went wrong. And so this whole thing about brands that are successful and leaders have got to review and challenge themselves to say, what else can we do to kind of help build more leverage, gain more market share, disrupt ourselves? And I don't know about the strategy of Coca-Cola, for example, our co-partners in this initiative. But I suspect when they have crafted their strategy around the portfolio, they looked at the market, they looked at the data, and they said, we are going to build a portfolio of brands that have specific roles that those brands must play in the market. And therefore, I would imagine that Coke, the mother brand, is the cash cow, and they realize that that's the strength of where the equity of the brand is. But they realize that people are moving off sugar. And therefore, they have to build a product and a proposition for a market for the future. And that's why they have now developed strategies to make sure that they can build relevance over time. And we're not just seeing this in one area, we're seeing it in other industries as well. This is Eagle Lager from Uganda. And they also challenged themselves and disrupted their own business. And the whole convention of beer must be made from hops and wheat, and this is one of the first clear beers in the world. Currently number 2 with over 30% market share. So the whole thing about challenging convention, challenging yourself, and having a challenger mindset, we believe is certainly a key ingredient for moving into the future. So to talk about Old Mutual for a little bit, because I have to pay the bills, Old Mutual is a business that's been around for 174 years, started in Cape Town in South Africa, and we now operate in 14 countries on the continent with over 31,000 employees, 11.6 million customers, and really growing across all the regions on the continent. And one of the big conversations with us has been, when you're an organization that is old as we are, where you have built infrastructure to service customers over time, and you have a business model that has served us well for the last 174 years, is it sustainable moving into the future? And so a core part of the challenge for us is that we are a business that actually people say is for older people in terms of our brand. We don't appeal to the markets that matter to us the most, which is the young market, so the youth, as well as the people that do have money. The middle market actually don't prefer us. They prefer other more premium brands, as it were. And in fact, one of the longest debates that I had with my CEO was a real question, which was, should we change the name? Because we have the little matter of old in our name. And it was a real debate. Should we change the name? And, he said, look, you need to give me the answer here, because if we're going to list this company back on the continent, and I need to tell our board whether or not we will list this company under a different name. And my answer to him was, I think we would be silly to lose an equity of 174 years. What we have to do is we have to make sure that we develop a strategy that can make sure that our brand is successful into the future. And the example that I used with him was, there is a movie, all of us, there is a movie that we all go and see every year for which outcome we already know. We pay money every year, or however often, to watch a movie for which outcome we all already know. That movie is James Bond. It's the same story. It's about a guy who drinks a martini, kills the bad guy to get the girl. That's the same story. It's the same story. We go and we pay money every time it comes out. It's the same script. But what they've managed to do is keep the essence of the brand the same, but kept it relevant and up to date with the times. So they up the tech, they up all of the digital platforms which they market, but fundamentally at its core, it's the same narrative. And in fact, if you look at the sales have gone through the roof since Daniel Craig kind of took on the role. And yesterday there was a big announcement that the next one is coming out in April next year, and it's going to be called No Time to Die. But the point I'm making is, in our discussion with the CEO, the conversation was, we've got to stay true to who Old Mutual is, but make sure that we keep it relevant, up to date. We challenge convention about our core business on a number of levels, one of which is the brand, and I'll talk you through the brand work. Another is our very inherent business model. So our business model as a financial services company in insurance is that we have advisors. We have a distribution force. In South Africa, we've got almost 10,000 advisors who deal with face-to-face engagement. But the data points tell us not everybody wants to speak to an advisor. So what do we do with online? Some people want to go direct online. So how do you build a distribution channel that is fundamentally at odds with your core traditional way in which you've built this business over 174 years? And these are some of the things that we've had to challenge ourselves on. And so we've been on a journey to really challenge ourselves and challenge our convention, and to build that challenger mindset to say, how can we really look at things from a different perspective? And one of the things that we've said is, we are no longer a South African company doing business in the rest of Africa. We are a Pan-African company and a Pan-African brand. That's a fundamentally different mindset. We can no longer take solutions from South Africa and hope that they will work in Nigeria. I told the story about funeral yesterday in Nigeria. Those things cannot work. We've got to stay true, and the solutions have got to be built from the ground up. But one of the big things for us has been culture. And we've spent a lot of time talking about culture, because you can't develop a challenger mindset without looking at what your culture is, because culture is the single biggest unlock, especially for companies that have been around for a long time. So we had a program called Project Pulse, which talks to the pulse, which is the heartbeat of the organization. And we brought in the top 250 leaders from across all of our countries, and we had a 4-day workshop in Cape Town. And we spent the first day talking about what are some of the great things that are in our organization that we must take forward. And there were lots of things that is great about our organization. But we also talked about what are the things that are holding us back as a company. And there were a lot of things that are holding us back. You know, I'll talk about 3. One of the biggest things that are holding us back is the pace of decision making. The 250 top leaders were talking about how frustrated they are at the pace of decision making in the organization. And we said, how can we unlock faster decision making? And a part of the process, we looked at global best practice. We had a great partner who was helping us through this process. And they brought in lots of international best practice and examples of what other companies are doing to really help drive faster decision making. And one of the examples which we adopted was from Amazon. And Jeff Bezos talks about this concept of type 1 and type 2 decision making. Type 1 decisions are decisions that are irreversible. Once you walk through that door, you can't go back. But type 2 decisions are reversible. You can change your mind. And Jeff Bezos writes in 2016, Amazon, as big a company as we are, we make between 10 to 15 type 1 decisions a year. Decisions that are irreversible. The rest of them are reversible. They can change their minds. And so they have a very different governance structure. For type 2, they are 30% of the way there and they start implementing. For type 1, there's a whole thing that they do, which is strict. There's governance, there's a board thing. And the point that they were trying to tell us is in our company, and lots of leader and history companies, we treat every decision like a type 1. It needs this forum, that committee, this thing, that thing over there. But actually, we can unlock faster decision making because if you really think about it, some of the decisions are, we can change our minds. And so we've now adopted some of those principles to say, how do we unlock faster decision making? We talked about trusting experts, and certainly marketing, comms, and brand is one of those where we aren't really trusted. They bring us in as experts, but then we manage decision making by committee. And so we've got to make sure that we are allowing the experts to really drive the decision making. And we certainly are a long way in terms of that journey. One of the other big decisions at a cultural level has been the shift from being product-led to being customer-led. And there's a standing joke in the insurance industry, what's the difference between marketers and actuaries? Marketers don't think they're actuaries. The point is that in our business, being product-led, the actuarial functions are the ones that drive the business. But actually, what needs to drive the business is what the customers want. And therefore, the whole move to customer centricity is a key part of what we want to drive. And if you've made that decision, it cannot be that you start with the product. You've got to start with the customer. And there's a whole program of how we'll bring customers into the conversation. So, Cultural Journey, great book. Patty from Netflix wrote a great book, and we've had conversations around culture. And this book talks about the culture at Netflix, which is built on 2 things, freedom and accountability. They've got 2 things that drive that whole business, freedom and accountability. So what do you think their leave policy is? Take leave. What do you think their maternity policy is? Do what's right for the baby. So there's a whole thing about freedom and accountability, and especially in big and large organizations, how do you start enabling some of these cultural changes and shifts that will really help to unlock some of that challenger mindset that I spoke about earlier? And so we then signed up as a leadership team that we will drive the cultural change that is required to really unlock value for the organization. And there was this big chart that was created, and all of our leadership signed on it, and we are on a journey to really make sure that the culture piece will really be a key enabler for us to deliver on our strategy. Because strategies are great, but they're delivered through people. And you've got to make sure that you align the people to the cause that you're trying to drive. And then we did work on the brand, and our brand is great brand, as I said, strong equity in the market, but we hadn't really seen a shift in our brand over time. And so we said, what can we do to make sure that we reinvigorate the brand, but that we take into account our context of Africa? And so through the brand work that we did, we developed a new persona for the brand that you see on the screen, and it starts with the sentence, "We are a vibrant and inspiring brand." You would never use the word Old Mutual and vibrant in the same sentence. And it talks about Afro-optimism, it talks about wisdom born of experience, it talks about solutions, African ingenuity. And in the Exco presentation, where we were sharing the new brand strategy, we probably spent about 30 minutes just on this one slide. And one of the big debates, or one of the questions that was asked was, is a brand a personification and manifestation of who you are, or is a brand a personification and manifestation of who you want to be? And that debate went on for at least half an hour, talking about, this whole conversation about balance, are we going to portray ourselves as something that we're not, or how we're going to stand, what is our position? And it was quite an interesting discussion. And in the discussion, we used Volvo as an example, who say their positioning is all about safety. And the debate was, surely Volvo weren't unsafe, and then they said they were going to be safe. And that was quite an interesting thing. But our point of view was, it's got to be true to who you are, but at some point you've got to take a position and then build and do everything to build on that positioning that you've taken. And that's why Volvo, for example, announced 2 years ago that in 2020, they will develop the first death-proof car in the world that really reinforces the whole thing around safety. And then we said there's 5 pillars of our strategy: to be more connected, more meaningful, more distinctive, more believable, and more consistent. And there's streams of work that are helping us to drive this across the board. And if you looked at our brand identity over a year ago, very inconsistent, very fragmented, and we used to tell everybody the only color you can use is green. So there were 50 shades of green. And so we went through a whole process to say the visual identity, yesterday I talked about the role of financial services, is to help bridge the gap between people's hopes and dreams and their reality. And based on that, we kind of worked on a new identity. We created the gap, and we did some amazing things. We split the logo. We brought more color. We said people can bring a lot more color and vibrancy into the brand. In Zimbabwe, they called it color blocking. So the guy is wearing blue, the gradient line is blue. So we started doing some interesting things with the brand. We went and took photography in every single country where we operate, because our imagery, we said, must be. When I travel, I don't want to see South Africans in the images of Rwanda. It's got to be the local people. So we went and did local photography. We did research. And really, really exciting new stuff. In East Africa, we operate as UAP, Old Mutual, and certainly the consistency in the brand across the continent was very, very important for us. think you kind of get the picture. So we spent, thank you very much. Thank you. And another big part of this is we said that this cannot be lipstick on a pig. We've got a great and inspiring and vibrant brand externally, but the customer experience sucks. So we're investing a lot of time on the customer experience, and we're investing a lot of time in a pipeline of innovation. And the innovation has to come from other parts of the continent. We've got some amazing things that we're doing in healthcare in East Africa. We've got a great partnership with EcoBank in West Africa, and some of the innovations at a product level are important because a funky brand means nothing if people can't experience and get something that's valuable. So the focus on customer value propositions is absolutely key. And so the premise of where we are, in conclusion, is to say that companies that will win in the future are companies that focus on three things. The first thing is having a challenger mindset with a purpose, with a very clear purpose, and really making sure you're challenging yourselves, challenging the culture, challenging convention of what has got you to the place where you are. The second piece is a unique brand of service, and a focus on customer experience is absolutely fundamental. And by the way, when you're competing on experience, you're not just competing in your own category. We're in financial services, but when we look at our app, it must be competing with Uber, because people have an Uber experience, they expect that same level and quality of experience across any other app they interact with. So the focus on customer experience is absolutely key. And the third piece is brands that are successful have an enviable people brand. Their people are great ambassadors for the brand, they're aligned to the purpose, and certainly we believe that those three components will be a key attributes of companies that are successful moving into the future. And if you focus on those three things and communicate well, we certainly believe that the money will flow. The money will flow, and the role that we play in that is absolutely critical. So there's been lots of articles written about challenger brands. I'd like to recommend these. There's a guy called Adam Morgan for a company called Eat Big Fish. We've done work with them, and they've been part of the journey with us. And really the Challenger project and the Challenger mindset is absolutely a key piece for what we all need to kind of move forward. So there are amazing things happening. There's so much change happening in our industry, in our category, across both the brand side, agency side, the community side, across all the piece. And I think forums like this really help us to come together and talk about our unique point of view and what that future needs to look like. And perhaps we don't have all the answers, and certainly at Old Mutual, we don't have all the answers. But what is clear is that solutions for Africa must come from Africa. And that's what we advocate, that we've got to make sure that we drive African ingenuity. I always look with interest at all of the national country plans and how well some of them are articulated. I think in Kenya, it's the Big Five. I think it's called the Big Five, and it's really well articulated. And other country plans that are really well articulated. But we haven't really thought about what's the continental plan that talks about the value and the proposition for Africa on the global stage. And I think conversations like this are just the beginning of how we can collaborate, have conversations together to make sure that we develop those solutions for this beautiful continent of ours, but also that we build the credibility of us as professionals. Because ultimately, when writing a story, make sure that you're holding the pen. And part of this process for us is about making sure that we hand the pen to ourselves so we can craft that story and that narrative around our profession, around the markets where we operate, and this beautiful continent of ours. Thank you very much.
A round of applause for Adisa. Thank you. I need you to stay on stage, probably sit right there in the middle. Right, yeah, that one. Thank you. Please, one more time, give it up for Adisa. Okay, we're going to take just a few questions because I'm sure you probably have one or two questions to ask him, or maybe comments to contribute to that presentation you just listened to. But maybe I kickstart by asking, What role do you see communication managers or strategists playing, especially when they have to manage big brands who are probably at the stage of, what you call arrogance of success? So in your own case, 174 years old, was it challenging for you to convince your, management that the fact that, yes, you are big, you are old enough, and you've stayed all of these years, you still need to be relevant? How easy or how challenging was it for you?
I can tell you that unfortunately, you've got to be resilient. The journey to come with this new, fresh, vibrant brand has been a 4-year journey. We made the decision, or we put it to Exco, that we need to do some fundamental shifts in the brand 4 years ago. And it's taken us 4 years to get to this point. And actually, we've lost a lot of time. But you had to go through the process of engaging stakeholders, putting the data on the table, and not just talking about the benefit. And one of the most valuable things that we did as part of this process was to talk about what would happen if we did nothing. And that was a very compelling story, because currently, in South Africa, which is our home market, our average customer's age is 44. We've got an aging customer database. Young people don't think we are Old Mutual's your mother's company, is the kind of the perception. And so we said, if we don't do anything, and by the way, we're not servicing them through the channels that they want to be serviced. And then we built the argument for, if you don't do anything, what do we think is a likely scenario? And that was, I think, quite compelling. So data, scenario planning, and giving people information around the impact of not making some of these decisions, I think is absolutely important. I think the second part of it is we've got to try and move up the value chain so that communications and marketing and brand are not after they've developed the business strategy. Okay, marketing, come give comms plan or a marketing plan to support this business plan. We've got to be inherently involved in the business plan itself. And how we've done that is to say, if you are customer-led, there are 3 things that you need to kind of do. The first thing that you need to do as in any business is to say, which markets are you going after and what's the size of the commercial opportunity? And marketing has played a great role in saying, we actually think these are the markets that we need to be going after, and we've even done commercial modeling for those markets. The second part is to then really say to the business, what do you need to design and deliver from a proposition point of view for those markets where you want to play? And then the third thing is about how you take it to market. And I think the more we can play a role along those 3 points, I think the more valuable and commercially important will be within that piece. But it hasn't been an easy journey. As I said, it's taken us 4 years to get to this point, and certainly from here on in, we're hoping those timelines will become shorter and shorter, because the reality is competitors are out there doing it at scale, at speed. We've got a bank in South Africa called Time Bank. They launched 6 months ago. They now have, I think it's 400,000 customers in 6 months. So if we don't do anything, I think we are seriously in trouble.
Thank you for sharing the insight views. We've got one question here.
Yeah, thank you. Quite interesting talk. So I'm Kose from South Sudan. So I'll pick up from one of your slide quote that you have put about solutions for Africa must come from Africa. So like we have this kind of things in African society where like some solutions that are coming in from local startup or companies, people tend to overlook them as if like they don't have more skills compared to big brands that are coming in from outside. So my question is like, how do you inject that into your marketing strategies that your customer base doesn't overlook on that point of looking on other side as having more skills on that point? Thank you.
Great, thank you. We operate in South Sudan, and it's a very interesting market given some of the challenges that are there, but we really see the opportunity in South Sudan. So I guess what is also very interesting for us as a brand is that when we look at competitors across all the markets where we operate, the majority of the competitors we compete So if you go, it's Britam, it's local players. It's not multinationals or internationals. There are in some instances, but in the bulk of the markets where we operate on the continent, it's the local insurers that are our biggest competitors. That in and of itself says something. And so the role that we are trying to play is to say that we bring lots of different things to the table when we enter the markets where we operate. From a regulatory point of view and an industry point of view, one of the compelling points of parity for us, of differentiation, is that we bring international best practice and we're able to elevate the standard of insurance to the markets where we operate, because we have all of the best practice and the standards from all of our different markets where we've got the learnings, and we bring that to markets where we operate. So from a standard, quality, lifting the standards and the governance in all the markets where we operate, I think that's a very compelling proposition from our point of view. But what it means from a marketing point of view is that we have got to make sure that how we communicate, not just at a country level, but even at a customer level. So what we are now doing, so we've got 6 core markets that we're going after. One of them is called the starting out market, which is the youth market. And when we talk to the youth market, we use words like, you'll forgive me, I'm not that market, but we use words like woke and lit and all of the words that these young people use, because that's the language they understand. When we speak to family providers, we have a very different language to how we speak to young people starting out. So it's about the granularity and the specificity of your messaging, and then we make sure that we've got very strong content strategies and calendars that can appeal to those markets at those moments of truth in their customer journey. So you've got to really be able to map out that customer journey and make sure that your messaging along the customer journey is appropriate, relevant, and really, and we talk about snackable content. Gone are the days where you try and, what we've done very well in the past, even on our website, is we try and take all the legal documents and put them online, or we try and express our internal structures externally. People want simplicity. And so snackable content and really making sure that it's relevant and appropriate certainly will be something that will resonate with customers across the piece.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please, one more time, give it up for Andisa Subene. Okay, while we still have you seated there, I think it's only proper to continue the conversation or dovetail into the conversation, which is the next session coming up. And it is in around the corporation playbook. And I think, Adisa, you have set the tone for the next conversation, of course, citing critical examples on why culture should be at the center of change in every step of the process. And of course, you did touch highlight and touch on the parts of leader brands versus challenger brands. So I think it will be interesting to just dovetail into the next session, which will critically take a look at multi-market corporations and their role in shaping Africa's image. And you did highlight or touch points where the solution for Africa to Africa should come from Africa. So at this point, it's my pleasure to request the pleasure of the Chief Communications and Public Affairs Officer of GE Africa, Patricia Obozua, to join us on stage. Patricia will be joining Adisa for this conversation, and to moderate this panel, it's our pleasure once again to invite Emilia Asim, it's our Chief Executive Officer, AML Nigeria. Emilia, welcome once again. Emilia, you want to come this way? Yes. Let's have a change. Super.
Thank you very much, Henry. Can you hear me? Okay, so we begin. I must say that a lot of conversations have happened in the past 2 days, and this is about taking a sneak peek into Patricia and Andisa's playbook, if they will admit that they have one. I would start with Patricia. And that smile, you know, it's as if, oh, don't start with me, but I'll start with you. And that's borrowing a thought from the last panel, where Nelson spoke about the fact that most of the time, when and where the decisions are made, you often don't find communication experts there. Now, that's different for you because you represent a legacy brand as well, or a heritage brand, if you allow me to use that phrase, and you are right there, you know, as the Director of Communications and Public Affairs for Africa, which means that you epitomize Speak for Africa in a great sense. So I'd like to find out from you, what has been your experience leading communications for and speaking for Africa, for a continent, working with a brand like GE? What has been your experience, and how would you summarize the responsibility that you have on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Right. So first of all, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks to the team for inviting me over. And it's been a bit of a rough couple of days with several priorities and responsibilities to deal with, so I haven't had time to prepare for this session. So what I'm going to do is what you wanted me to do anyway, which is speak my mind. So is everyone fine with that? Candid, real conversation. Yes. So working for a company like GE and representing Africa, communicating about Africa, is a huge responsibility. And I have to go back by saying that any company that is operating in Africa and is serious about growing in Africa, whether they know it or not, you have a vested interest in setting the right narrative about Africa. And why do I say this? It's because, first of all, if you're going to grow in a region, and I find a lot of companies, like we're talking about multinational companies here.
Yes.
A lot of multinational companies have only recently started focusing on Africa. And when I say recently, like the past, I don't know, 10 years maybe. So if you're serious about growing in Africa, then you want to bring in investment from, oftentimes is the HQ of the company, sometimes is a parent company. So you want to bring in investment to grow your business here. Any CEO responsible for Africa will tell you that that's a huge task for them. So no matter how you see it, there's a vested interest in communicating. And I like what one of the speakers earlier said, communicating accurately about Africa. So we're not trying to paint a rosy picture that doesn't exist. We're trying to show the continent as it is. And even going further to that, so I lead communications for GE across Africa, but it's several different countries. So even that whole concept of Africa being treated as one place needs to be changed. If you're going to grow business in a continent, then you're going to be growing business in each country. So that's another side to the responsibility. But even going further, as communicators, we have to be strategic advisors. Everyone said it, and Disa said it in his presentation as well. You have to be strategic advisors for your company's growth. You can't just be issuing press releases and making announcements and organizing events. So if you're a strategic advisor for your company's growth, then you need to take it as an important responsibility to communicate accurately how what Africa is today. So that's a responsibility I take very seriously. I mean, I can go into many more details. But what you find is you need to be bold because you are in a place where a lot of people don't sit. When it comes to people in marketing...
That's for your role in particular?
Yeah, okay. In communications. When it comes to people in marketing, it's very clear to them that if you're not, if you don't come down to what's locally relevant and what's true, you're not going to sell, especially in consumer goods. But when it comes to communications, the lines start to gray a little bit. And then when you move from consumer goods to B2B companies, it starts to become even grayer because people don't see their results immediately. So that's why in a role like mine, you have to take it extremely seriously as an important responsibility to communicate the accurate story about Africa.
All right. I would like Andisa, because I wanted to come back to the business case for that and where there are truly challenges and then managing, but Andisa, what are your thoughts? Yours is also a legacy brand, having been in existence for so many years. So how do you find your different operations across different countries on the continent, and how does that help what Old Mutual is trying to say, and then the broader narrative about Africa?
Thanks for that. So I think at its core, our business is about helping people to translate their hopes and dreams into reality. And that's why I said yesterday, the wonderful thing about it is everyone dreams. And therefore, in every country we operate in, we've got a role to play because we've got to help those specific markets. But we absolutely are in markets that are fundamentally different from each other. I spoke about South Sudan a moment ago, where there are significant challenges that we all know about. We are also operating in Zimbabwe at the moment, and Zimbabwe is a big business for us, and the economic challenges in Zimbabwe are real and they're very significant. In fact, at some point in the last 5 years, our own employees were not paid a salary in Zimbabwe, and they continued to work for up to 4 to 6 months without getting a salary, and they still came to work. So the nuances and the differences across all of the markets where we operate is absolutely important. And so my role is to look across the continent and say, because we are a multinational, we've got to recognize what are some of the things that are the commonalities across all of our markets, but also make sure that we appreciate the deep and real realities of each of the different countries where we operate. And so one of the things, I'll just give you an example, one of the things that we started to do was to look at how many customer value propositions do we have across the entire continent. And through an exercise, we found out that we have over 50 different customer value propositions across all of the markets where we operate. That means over 50 different teams of people working to develop products, develop IT systems, customer experience journeys for all of the markets where we operate. And then we did research across about 8 of our countries to say, actually, what does the market want and how many value propositions do we need? And through that process, we came to the point that said, we actually think that there are 6 core markets that we need to be going after. Those markets we believe are consistent across the continent. Young people starting out, family providers, people facing retirement, informal market, SMEs and corporates. And actually there's commonalities between some of those. So if you're a family provider in Rwanda, Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya, you want the same things, best education for your kids. Some of the stuff is the same. And therefore, you can build a platform where 70% of the product development is the same, and actually where the real nuances is in the 30%. And that helps you drive scale, drives clarity of communications, helps you develop better propositions, and really makes sure that we're a lot more focused rather than trying to do 50 things, trying to address 50 different, but actually we're going after the same customer groups. So my role at a strategic level is to help make sure that we all got an aligned strategy, but then make sure that we recognize the very real realities of the markets where we operate. And there's a balance. But our point of view is we win in country. That's where we win. You can't win it from head office. And therefore, in any decision that's to be made, the local country and their perspective must trump.
Thank you, Andisa. That's from a B2C perspective. I know that G is a B2B company. You mentioned, hinted about being bold, so I want to take that a bit further. The business case for contributing to the image of the continent or shaping the narrative begins with the fact that your organization is a business in the first case. And so the balance between what you're trying to achieve as an organization, which is new business models, in some cases new markets in Africa, as well as what that translates in terms of the contributions that come from there to either growing the economy or building skills. So when you say it requires you being bold, can you share a bit more about that with respect to either the challenges that you face managing media organizations in some cases, as was said yesterday, where there's a skew in perception of what Africa should represent. So yes, we want to communicate what is accurate, but where what is accurate is not particularly good or pleasing, what do you do?
Okay. So you've heard from everyone, you've heard from media, you've heard from development agencies.
Yes.
People are going to communicate what's going to drive their objective. So you can't control that. You can't be angry with development organizations because they're showing starving children with flies in their eyes. The reason they're doing it is because their objective is to bring in funding. And you have to show a bad situation to show that you need help. One a lot of people don't talk about is the tourism industry as well. I mean, the tourism industry shows a lot of beautiful animals in the wild and beautiful sunsets. How many of us, ever come across those sunsets in our busy lives? And, the whole world thinks that we live side by side with lions and elephants and giraffes. But the reason is you're trying to sell a safari. So we who lead communications for organizations like GE, we're trying to sell a story that brings investment to the country. So why do you want to sell? Why don't you leave the other stories to people who stand something to gain from those? And the media is made up of several profit-making companies as well. They're going to publish what sells. So for us, if we want to provide infrastructure equipment for electricity, for healthcare, for example, we need to be able to attract investors. We find that each country is not necessarily able to pay for everything that they might need. The private sector is not who should bring in investments, is not able to bring that kind of investment that's required for huge infrastructure type equipment. You need financiers, you need you need financing organizations, you need banks, you need a whole mix of people. So how are you going to get all that to happen if you're not showing the positive side to investing in Africa? There's a reason the company came to Africa in the first place to invest. It's because they saw something positive economically. So that's what you need to be showing to people. And that's why I said they have a vested interest. It's not uncommon for a CEO of my company, a CEO for GE Africa, to speak to groups outside of Africa saying, this is where you need to come and invest. And then people talk about corruption. It's not uncommon for my CEO to say, well, there is corruption in Africa and there's corruption in other places.
Okay.
But it takes two to tango. So if you don't want to be exposed to corruption, respect the processes in the countries. Don't look for shortcuts. So these are the kind of messages that people like us can deliver to the world at large and promote Africa's image. So we're not doing it just because it's a noble cause. There is a business case for it. And when I talked about being bold, so we in communications. How many people here, by the way, work for multinationals? Okay, quite a few hands. Has anybody ever been faced with those beautiful creatives And
that show giraffes and monkeys.
Well, not giraffes and monkeys, but beautiful creatives that come from HQ and you're to execute in your country. Who has been faced with those kind of situations? So, and you know, simple words like, oh, just adapt it.
Yeah.
Adapt it
the communication for the
yeah,
local
adapt
market.
it for Africa. How many people know how difficult it is to adapt something that's fundamentally wrong in the messaging? When we, okay, I see some hands up for that one. So the boldness comes in pushing back. You need to have a seat at the table. And I know somebody asked, how do you have a seat at the table? For me, it's been a bit of a chicken and egg situation. I push back because I don't have a seat on the table, and in a positive way, by the way. So I push back because I don't have a seat at the table. And because I push back, I end up getting a seat on the table. But it's not next week you get the seat, though. It's diligence, over time, consistently driving your message home. So for me, the best way for a communicator to do it is, whatever little budget you have, invest in high-quality content. Invest in high-quality photography. Invest in understanding the stories that you're going to tell. So when HQ comes with these fancy things, you're not just complaining, always being the victim. Why are they always portraying Africa in this way? You're saying, this looks good. However, I have something better that you could use. Sometimes it's one image that changes everything. Sometimes it's providing that image that makes people think we got this totally wrong. If you don't know your importance as a communicator, nobody's going to. And you think, a lot of times people are being political. You want to please someone back in HQ. You want to say, oh, this looks beautiful. You know, you're a genius for even creating such a thing. It's so perfect. You want to please someone in HQ, but in the long run, it doesn't help. You can get your company into trouble. How many Kenyans are in the house? Any Kenyans? What if you were working for the New York Times and that beautiful job ad came out and you didn't advise your company on the right wording to use? For those who don't know about that story, please go and check it out. So I was reading through it. The New York Times is advertising for a role for, I think it was a bureau chief. And the wordings, the way they framed it was offensive to the Kenyans. But do you think the New York Times was trying to offend Kenyans? Absolutely not. They simply didn't have somebody in Kenya to look at the ad and say, maybe we shouldn't phrase this way. Maybe this isn't how we want it to look. Obviously, it wasn't directed at Kenyans only. It was a global ad. But what people found offensive were things that could be easily picked. So that's your importance as a communicator. And I'm speaking to everyone, every communicator who works for a multinational.
But you mentioned something, sorry to cut you, mentioned something that is reality. You said with the little budget that you have. Now, budget, I'm going to ask Andisa as well, with economic pressure and cuts. And you know, when it comes to budget cuts, most times communication, takes the hit. So when you say with the little budget that you have, again, and I want Andisa to answer this as well. So the reality of investing in quality content, for instance, or even making that, let me start with making that case for the budget, and the budget is never enough, for the budget that you truly need to deliver on the objectives and the value that the organization expects, especially from HQ, from your team in the first place. Andisa, do you want to go first, or you want Patricia?
Well, why don't you go, Andisa?
Yeah. I was going to say that I worked for a multinational, and creative was developed somewhere else, and it was for Christmas. And that it came, and the first thing, it's called Santa, and then it had snow. And I was like,
Snow?
Snow, South Africa. And it's Santa. We don't call him Santa, we call him Father Christmas. Sure. So we've been in that movie of multinationals that develop creative from different places.
Good intentions, of course.
Of course. So I think from a budget perspective, I'll say two things. The first one is we're very good at asking for money. we're not good at telling the business what they get for the money. And I think that's a very real challenge that we've got to look at ourselves and say, are we really good at telling the business what they're going to get for the money? The second part is we've certainly moved a long way in the last couple of years to get to outcomes-based scorecards. So even in our communication scorecard, we've got targets. So we say we will have 32, top stories. Our Facebook followers will move from X to Y. So we've got real outcomes-based metrics, and we've got quality metrics and measures.
Qualitative.
Yeah, to make sure that it is. So I would say those are the two things, so that when you start talking about money, there's almost a commerciality to it. And I agree with Patricia. We've got to focus on fewer, high-value, high-impact things, because we love to have this laundry list of so many things that we want to do. And I think simple is hard, but we've got to get to that place where we're doing fewer things that have higher impact.
Okay.
So, yeah, so when it comes to budget,
in New York, you're trying to fight for ×2 from last year.
So I was very careful about my words of whatever little budget you have, because it's you can either do it this scale or you can do it this scale. But the prioritization is what I'm talking about. To make it a priority to develop the right content that would help your business. So what I found is, if I keep getting these things from HQ that I don't like, and this is not in GE necessarily,
generally,
in different companies, if I keep getting these things from HQ that I don't like, and I keep showing them what I have, and they become willing to use it, over time, that budget in HQ, some of it starts being allocated to creating the content here. And and I don't know, it works very differently in different companies. Sometimes I don't ask for people to give me a budget. I simply say, why don't I help you in creating XX content from your budget? So no one's transferring anything. It's just that you're going to have me bugging you in conference calls every other day and reviewing again. And even over the past 3 days, I've been on such similar calls where we're having something, it's going to happen, an event is going to happen in New York, but it's focused on Africa. But I'm not asking for a budget to come here. These guys know New York much better than I do. So they develop the content, but I'm with them every day, guiding every step of the way what's going to come through. So people love budgets. And so when you ask for an additional budget, it's always a fight. If you look at the objective and think about creative ways to achieve the same objective, then it becomes a little easier. And even those budgets you thought you couldn't get, you start to get them eventually. Not always. There are other factors to consider.
All the time.
All the time, other factors to consider. But you need to prioritize it. And you need to know that we have a unique role to play in changing that narrative on Africa.
Okay. Henry says I need to take questions now. I wanted to now...
I was just going to make one.
Henry, please, can you...
I was just going to make...
Thank you.
I was just going to make a point about part of the narrative story is balancing short-term versus long-term. So in our business case is very simple. GDP growth rates that are happening outside of South Africa, which is our home base, are, second to none. Population sizes in the rest of Africa, and the low insurance penetration. Nigeria, I said 200 million people, less than 1% insurance penetration.
Yes.
But in order for you to invest in the rest of the continent, in Africa in general, you've got to have a long-term outlook. And that's always the dilemma, because short-term versus long-term. And I think we've got to play a role in really saying that people who are really passionate about the continent, who are really wanting to deliver solutions, have actually got to be here for the long haul. And companies like GE and others have certainly shown that they are committed to being a part of this wonderful place.
All right, do we have questions, or can I ask?
Hello.
In the absence?
Okay, there is a question.
Thank you. My name is Biodun again from Nigeria. My question is for Andisa. Thank you for a brilliant presentation earlier. So I wanted to ask, insurance in Nigeria has about 1% penetration, as you said, and affordability, I think, is one reason. Culture is another. Now, you said that culture is at the center of the stage. So what are you doing to change the status quo in Nigeria? And particularly, what are you doing to attract the youth segment outside of your new your new corporate ID?
Corporate identity. Okay.
Oh, great.
Any other question?
Do we have any other question for now? Okay, there's a question.
I think we should take it, please.
Okay, my name is Albert. I think my question is in regards when you have, for example, so I work in Nigeria LNG, and Shell is our mother firm. So what happens is they come in with a global solution that has worked somewhere, and they try to impose it on us. Like, this thing has worked, you implement. And most times it's probably not favorable for our business strategy or the people we are doing our business with. But because our leadership wants us to implement, so there's this bit of back and forth, and sometimes we implement, but it now fails. So the question now is, how do we find a common ground where even if your boss wants something, you have to communicate to him that this thing will not work before him wanting to let's see, even if it won't work, let's try it and let me see it won't work. But rather than getting to that space, how can we prevent getting to that space? Thank you.
Okay. So start with you, Patricia.
Okay, to answer the energy question. Well, for me, where I start from is staying close to the business operations and what are we after? Because a lot of communicators tend to sit in the background and complain about not being included. But how about you ask every single person who's organizing business reviews to include you in those meetings? It's just an additional name on the email list.
Thread.
So you understand what's happening with the business at every point in time, because things don't come from the blue. Things don't come from HQ out of nowhere. If you're staying close to the business, you know that something is coming. So that's the point where you start influencing. Sometimes things come to you, you didn't see it coming. You can't be perfect.
But your role makes that possible for you to influence. How many how many communicators can influence from inception or from the strategy phase? Because you're in global leadership.
Because I say this to people that work for me as well.
Okay.
Join the meetings. Nobody says, no, I'm not going to let you join it, except if it's something really confidential, like a deal that, people don't say, no, don't join the business review, especially when it's on the phone. If it's in a small room, fine, maybe there are not enough chairs. But join and we're not saying get people to schedule things for you. I'm saying their normal rhythm. Every business has its normal rhythm, where things are reviewed, when it's business to business, its orders are being reviewed, what's in the pipeline. Just join those meetings. It's a time investment, though, and it takes away from you doing something else, but it's time well spent. So if you understand that, you can start seeing things coming. However, you might not have seen it coming.
True.
There are two possibilities. First of all, it's not always going to fail. Sometimes it's going to work, and it's going to work really well. So if I don't see this coming, I give it a chance, first of all, to see if there's some way we can make it work because it was successful elsewhere. And if I give it that chance, then it's either going to work or it's going to fail. And I'm not afraid of things failing.
Or learning that lesson.
Yeah, if it fails, it's a lesson for the next time. It's usually not colossal when it's something that came from elsewhere because everyone's just trying it out. But the important thing is to know when to stop when it's failing. You don't keep going and keep pushing it and keep pushing it. But if you're always the voice that says, it's not going to work, it's not going to work, it's not going to work, then nobody listens to you. But if you try to make something work and it doesn't work, you can use that moment to inject yourself into the process that happens before it comes to you, so that you start to know. Like, I would say something simple like, Well, this didn't work, unfortunately. In future, I'd really like to be involved at this stage because we could provide XXX advice.
Because Africa is different, so if
Africa is different, Nigeria is different, Kenya is different, or whatever.
I mean, for global
exactly.
products or
You
services.
can do, and sometimes it might be offering advice that if you had given before could have made that work. So it's a constant thing, and it's never going to stop. You build your credibility. The more you build your credibility, the more influence you have in those sorts of decisions. But you need to be bold to push back. Don't complain. Don't wait and complain, while grabbing coffee or whatever. Push back. It's your boss. But your boss is only going to be as successful as what you deliver. When you lead a function or a business or whatever, you very quickly realize that you have no power but what your people have. Of course, you can fire and you can hire, but fire everyone and see if that's real power. So your boss is going to, at some point, listen to you if you're going to add value. Where you typically have a problem is you are always saying, no, it won't work, no, it won't work.
All right, thank you, Patricia. And Disa?
So Nigeria,
penetration, insurance penetration.
Yeah,
right, that's the question.
yeah. So in Nigeria, obviously is a special place for us. Big opportunity that it represents. But there's three things that are important for us. The first one is financial inclusion and education. If you look at people that are outside of the financial system in Nigeria, massive opportunity, because we believe the more people we can bring in, the greater the opportunity for all of us will be. The second piece is about digital and leveraging digital as a platform for us, because we just cannot afford to have face-to-face foot soldiers on the ground. So we're making big investment into digital to make sure that we can leverage it, but also looking at social influences. And we work with people like Nimi Akingube, who does financial education in that market, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think the third piece is probably the most important, is I do believe that there's an opportunity for insurers to work together, because the job that we've got to do in Nigeria is to actually grow the category. So once we grow the category,
Beyond
all
the
of
brand
us
to
win.
the industry.
All of us win. And we did an interesting exercise a few years ago in Nigeria, where we actually did a campaign where we burnt a car. We put it on fire near the freeway. I mean, everyone knows the traffic in Lagos. And we had this fire that was burning, and we had this big sign on top saying, "This could be your car. Get insurance." And all of us put money together as insurers to drive that campaign. And that certainly is about growing the category and making sure all of us will be successful, because with 1%, the only way we can go is up.
Okay. Henry is looking at me. Last words in 1 minute. With respect to your role or the role of communicators in contributing to the image of the continent and helping to shape that narrative, even as multinational brands. Patricia?
Okay, for me, I'm going to talk about the role of communicators, but even just as people. Today, we have an unprecedented opportunity to influence perceptions of just about anything. Before, you had to publish something in the paper, an editor is making the decision. You want to go to TV, there's a producer making the decision. But today, with social media, blogs, the sky's the limit. So each person has a responsibility if you want to change the narrative on Africa, not just companies, not just communicators. Everyone can be a communicator. Just start changing it. Tweet something. Post something on Instagram. Post something on LinkedIn. Apparently, we consume media 11 hours of every day. I read that. It's crazy. That's half our lives are spent consuming media. Assume you sleep for 8 hours. So you can influence people if people are constantly on their devices. Everyone can, you have a captive audience to influence. So it's your responsibility. Go out, take some action. Don't just complain. Do something about it.
Lisa?
Cool. So in the 1930s, 2 Dutch shoemaking companies sent their sales reps to Uganda to look for opportunities. We all know the story. After 1 month, one sales rep phoned head office and said, "I'm coming home. Nobody wears shoes." A month later, the other sales rep phoned head office and said, "Bring everybody. We're going to open up a factory here. Nobody wears shoes." 2 people looking at one thing, and one person saw an opportunity where the other didn't. And I almost think that's kind of our role, is we've got to think about what is that difference in the narrative that we want to bring to bear that can help just change the opinion ever so completely. And it's a responsibility that we must take very, very seriously.
Thank you, Andisa. Thank you very much.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please let's give a warm round of applause to our panelists and, of course, delectable moderator. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Andisa. And thank you, Amelia. May we have Perez join our panelists for a photo session. While that is going on, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so much for your time so far. It's still the Global African Forum on Communications, and we've had a whole lot of insightful conversations and discussions in and around how we need to change the narrative about the new Africa we all hope and dream about. And of course, more conversations will continue in just a moment. So from the corporate playbook, we are going into the power play sessions. Now, everything all ties in perfectly, because as we continue to chart a new course in a new way to change the narrative, shape the narrative, and make the continent positioned in the best possible light, it's also important for us to get the buy-in of the key stakeholders, which would include the government and the people of the countries we all represent collectively as a continent. So it's on this note that we would like to go into the next session of conversations with our panelists, looking into the topic, or shall I call it the issue, truth, power, and politics, managing political communication in a post-truth era. And if there's something that resonates all through the conversations right from when we started the sessions this morning, it's been in and around speaking your truth. Speaking the truth. Truth, as Wendy Liu once mentioned this morning or during her session, truth leads to brand trust. And as a continent, if we think the continent is a brand, then it's important that the truth must set precedents. On this note, it's my pleasure to invite on stage for this session the Honorable Minister of Information from the Republic of Ghana. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency, Mr. Kojo Oppong Nkrumah. And closely following him and joining him as well, and I like the team play here, please make welcome for former Commissioner for Information, Rivers State, South Nigeria, and Chief Executive Officer of Shopper Nigeria Limited, Ibn Seminitari. A round of applause for both of them. Thank you so much. I like the fact that our panelists are very much in sync. And to moderate this session, ladies and gentlemen, please let's make welcome for an erudite journalist, and she currently works with Plus TV Africa, delectable, beautiful Marian Ayo. A round of applause for Marian. Marian Okon, yeah, welcome. Okay, Marian, it's all yours.
Hello? Okay, this is working now. All right. Well, I'd like to start by saying that I just a few minutes ago realized that the Honorable Minister was an honor person years ago. So I think that we're all in the same industry sitting here. All right, so we're looking at the power plays, of course, in politics, and most of the time communication is a big issue. The last panel just talked about messaging, which is also very important when you're trying to convey a message. And we also find ourselves in an era where truth is no longer truth. Truth can be debunked or debated. So before we used to have truth and lies. Now we have truth, we have lies, we have something that is somewhat benign that you might not want to call fake or false, so we just leave it there, hanging. So I'll go to my first question. I'll start with you, Honorable Minister. What ways can governments communicate with the people clearly, especially in a state of crisis or you're trying to quell a situation? What is the best way to speak clearly to the people and also not let it affect your moral? Because there's an issue with messaging when it comes to leadership. There's certain information that you think you should keep to yourself until it's okay to divulge it. But then the citizens are on the other hand saying, tell us the truth, we want to know what's happening, carry us along. So where does morality or moral value stop and where does governance continue?
Well, thank you. And I think it's afternoon now, so good afternoon. 2 quick comments. I enjoyed the all-female panel very much, and I look forward to more of it. And I also want to encourage Perez and the organizers. This is such a brilliant idea, and I want to encourage them to keep it up as the years go by. And in the next 5-10 years, it will be really big on the global scene, and I just want to spend a moment to encourage them for what they've started here. I think first, looking at the subject that you've given us, one of the first things that we were talking about is what is truth, because there's this supposition that we are in a post-truth era, which means that there was an era when there was just truth and lie. But even in that era, truth was still relative. Your truth and my truth and some other perspective that somebody may have, but it's a bit worse now. Today you have the basket of alternative facts, which include the facts themselves and the alternative truths, etc. Then you have the alternative narratives that people may come up with, because at first there was a fact, and then there was the generally accepted narrative. These days, in the basket of alternative facts, or upon that basket, there can be alternative narratives that are built. And then you also have the subject of alternative or democratized media channels. In Ghana, for example, a few decades ago, where you had the national broadcaster and the national radio station and a couple of national newspapers, it was a different ballgame. Today, it's a democratized space where over 6 million people are on Facebook with their own, or some have their own television channels on social, over 300 radio stations, hundreds of newspapers. So it's a different ballgame altogether. I think what needs to happen is that you don't have to wait to be hit by crisis before you now attempt to figure out the landscape or begin to recalibrate it. In this new dispensation, there are 2 big things that I think every communicator, particularly for those of us in public or government communications, must realize. 1, you need to recognize the new dynamics, and 2, adapt, in this new space. And in recognizing the new dynamics, I've spoken briefly about some of the new things that are happening on the landscape. But beyond some of these specifics, you would notice that a new dimension has been introduced about what I call disinformation. Well, not just what I call, but what is called the world over disinformation, where you have people not just put out alternative facts, etc., but people who now get into the era of deliberately calibrating or putting together material that is just untrue, that is aimed at affecting the ecosystem. It may be in country, it may be within the continent, it may be globally. But wherever it is, that's one of the new dynamics in the marketplace that we have to respond to. So what do we do? One of the first things that I think we need to do is to ensure that there's a lot more enlightenment within the consumer population about the new dynamics. The days are gone when you could just leave the consumer and expect that either you or your PR person could put out a narrative and the consumer would receive it and believe it. Today, the consumer needs to be assisted in also understanding that not all of the channels that you're seeing out there are genuine mainstream media channels. Not all the supposed facts that are coming out there are real, genuine facts. This is how to test for what the genuine fact is, or these are the sources of facts on which we can build narrative. So a few specifics. 1, we need to create awareness of the dynamic so that as a consumer is empowered and he knows the ecosystem that has changed, it's easier to get your message across. 2, we need to insist on the verifiable facts always, because all of this conversation about truth or narrative, etc., are being built on some facts. And if you're in an era where people are conjuring facts or putting out alternative facts or half-truths, etc., etc. We need to bring down the conversation always back to the verifiable facts. What are the verifiable facts? And then I can proceed to build my narrative on it. You can even have an alternate narrative that we can debate, but what are the common facts that we won't disagree about? Number 3, I think we need to also do some work choosing the justifiable the justifiable narrative, or justifying our narrative. There's a conversation earlier today, I think, from Chioma from the electricity company, or one of them in Nigeria, who talks about the fact that they want you to say something. How does that sync with what is actually going on internally? And I think whatever narrative we're going to put out there, there must be that sync or that justification, there must be that truth, because the people out there are very empowered these days and want to know the truth. Mm-hmm. What they call the truth. That is the total sum of the possible narratives around the facts as we have it. So whatever narrative that we are choosing to go out there and tell them, if the lights are off and the engineers are not on top of it, whatever narrative that we are trying to put out there, that narrative must be justified by or with what the consumer at the end of the day can actually believe, even if he tests it in one way or the other. The days of Gobelian PR, where you could spin some things and just expect everybody will swallow it because of the dynamics I spoke about, are no longer possible. So even in choosing a narrative, we have to choose a narrative that is justified, a narrative that can be believed by the majority of the people, because it's not what you sell that matters. It's what the people are willing to buy. That for me is the most important. And then the final 2 things, we must also multiple channel out. Again, the days when you could just call your PR firm and agree on a narrative and ask them to put it out there does not necessarily mean that every consumer out there is going to even see that particular narrative, because they may not even be consuming from that media channel. So we must also multiple channel out, including very heavy work on social and heavy work on proprietary channels. Yesterday I spoke about platforms, but I think all of us must also recognize that as communication channels have been democratized, we also now have an obligation to own proprietary channels, whether on social or in mainstream, to get our message out there. Mm-hmm. The churches and the mosques and the religious communities are doing that very often. You switch on television in many of our African countries today, and you see a lot of churches owning their own channels and blasting their messages out. You may have challenges with the message and be surprised at the thousands of people they have, but it's because, I think one of our panelists said earlier, it's the story that gets told over and over and over again that gets believed. And we also must begin to invest more in multiple channeling out. And then very finally, 2 things. We need some more agility as public PR persons. In the political space, there's this whole theory that you guys have to be the gentle guys and get everything right before you speak and don't be aggressive. But we need some more agility in how we go about our work, because the market space is no longer the same. Quick in response, proactive in putting our word out there, not waiting for 3 weeks before respond. Live right now in Ghana, there's a scenario we are handling where a chief executive of a major public organization has been caught on camera, apparently involved in some acts that appear untoward. What we have had to do as a government within the last 2-3 hours is to very quickly have him suspended and referred to the Office of the Special Prosecutor and the Commission for Human Rights and Administrative Justice. Why? Because the consumer at the end of the day is looking at the reputation of the organization, the government, and everything together. Are you going to spend 3 or 4 weeks to have a preliminary investigation before you take some action, or are you going to be agile in responding in good time so that the consumer can still stay in sync with the brand?
But that is Ghana, and good thing that is happening in Ghana. But then we live, let me use Nigeria for example. So something happens, and it takes forever. So it takes for people going on Twitter. I'm sure all the Nigerians here can agree with me. Yes. So it takes us going on Twitter and screaming and yelling, and then the government decides what to bring out. And then you said something about, dealing with the issue. So in Nigeria, if there's no public outcry, nobody is suspended. Nobody steps aside. The EFCC will work. So in a case where the media really, all they can do is scream, and the government is not as responsive, where do the people stand? How do we get that communication to flow? Because that's how I started this questioning.
Yes.
How do we have to push and scream and squeal until, you know?
Well, so from a government PR communication point of view, I would say you don't even have to wait for segments of the communication or segments of the public to scream. You have a certain reputation with which you came to power. For example, our administration came to power on the benchmark that our current president is incorruptible, will not tolerate corruption, will fight it head on, he will protect the public purse. And therefore, you don't need to wait for the public to raise issues before you do that what you think is in sync with the brand and the brand values as we've articulated from day one.
Okay.
So I think I'm speaking to public PR managers across Africa who may be following our conversation that you don't need to wait for the public to scream. And then very finally, the public PR practitioners have to be involved at the very top. If I take a cue from some of our conversations earlier, it doesn't help if they are sitting somewhere down the ladder and then the mess is created and you call them to come and clean up. It doesn't work well. They've got to be right at the top with you at the decision-making table so that they can inform the brand conversations, the reputation conversations, and how it should be factored into everything that you're doing.
Ibim, so he's laid a foundation, openness and communication, carrying the people along. How can information be managed for a public that is consuming whatever it is on social media and a government who is not necessarily apt to speaking? Hence the reason why we have a consumption of fake news, because people are left to speculate. How do we bridge that gap, especially using Nigeria as a case study?
Well, so the first thing we must agree is that we're in an era where consumers are first of all emotional. And it's important that if you're a public communications person, you understand that. I'm not sure that the reason people consume alternative facts or fake news is just because the truth or the facts are not there, but the fact that you're dealing in an era when people are not very patient and people will take ideology and emotion over and above. If you understand that, then you do the next thing that you must do if you're a public communications person. And I think the Honourable Minister has dealt a lot with that. You've got to be proactive. You've got to draw up a communication plan that will address various stakeholders. You must understand all of your publics and what message will resonate with each of those publics. And you must find ways to have people tell your story beyond yourself. Now, and I say this, I mean, from my experience, one of the things that worked for me in managing government communication was finding champions who told our story ahead of time. If there's going to be a government policy, you are aware of what that policy is. And, you know, the first thing that people who manage public communication must understand is that if a policy is announced before you have drawn up a communication plan, you're in trouble. So the first thing is that there's a policy, for instance, to do X, Y, Z. You must know it ahead of time. You must map out a strategy to get people on board before that announcement is made. You must identify who will be the most troubling people. So is it a policy that will affect labor? You must then have had a communication plan with the NLC or with the labor people. You must know which of the labor people who would actually help you announce your plan. It's not every time that the communication must come from the official government source. It could come from different sources. And the reality is that it's not just saying, you know, I hear everybody saying, oh, you know, social media. It's not just saying, oh, this social media person, this blogger is prominent. No. It's understanding if that blogger has credibility, believability, access to the kind of publics you want to talk to, so that you know what message you're passing through what channel. But at the heart of public communication is being proactive and having a plan.
Talking about being proactive, you see, when we talk about these things, we mostly are talking about people like us who are in this room who have access to the internet. What about the people who need government the most? Those in the rural areas, those who don't have access to Twitter and Facebook, who rely on traditional media like radio or maybe TV for those who can afford it. Does community radio come to play here? Do we have more of that in Africa?
And that was why I said various channels. Community radio is one way, yes. But if you talk about far-flung communities, for instance, in the Niger Delta, you then find that even your community radio might not work. So you're going to have to use town hall meetings. You're going to have to use market unions. You're going to have to use age grade associations. You may even have to use masquerade displays to tell your story.
But the question is, are we really making use of those channels, or we just say them?
Well, again, I would have to then rely on work I did. And at the time when I managed government communication, one of the things that I did was my principal had town hall meetings where we went into rural communities and engaged one-on-one. Because the truth is, if you're dealing with rural Africa, you've got to think beyond Twitter and TV and radio. You've got to think about going into the rural communities and actually engaging the people. When you don't engage them, rumor takes sway.
Okay, back to you, Honorable Minister. What policies do you think that the African government can actually develop to carry people along in the rural areas, apart from, I'm talking about policies now, that can take the people along? Because what an African wants is a voice, an opportunity, to be part of governance. They do not want to be far away. So hence the reason, I'm sure that's why there are local government authorities and all of that. But what more policies can be put in place so that the people can really feel the pulse of governance?
So, two quick things, but I think they dovetail into the same thing. The first is that if you are trying to be proactive in any measure with communication, it starts with the communication people being at the table to understand, to troubleshoot, to ask the questions, to give feedback, so that they can even develop whatever strategies that will get the word to ground. And I think, regrettably, across Africa, that is one space that we have to do a lot more work on, in getting people in the public communication space at the table and given the room to participate and get a deep understanding so that they can then do a good job. Else, if you start the exercise before you bring them in, you are in trouble. And it is a major thing that I think we must send as a message to governments across the continent. That's the first thing. And perhaps also in so doing, communication in Africa is not just what you see above the line, but also below the line internally. African politics and African governments are such that right from the top down to the local unit committee in Ghana, there's a political party, there are party people who are involved, there are government communications persons who are involved. If the people at the top don't know, they can't even translate the message internally down to their own people, at the very bottom to get the word out. The rules don't change, really, whether you are in public practice or in private practice. Our job as communicators or PR managers starts with the consumer, not necessarily the finance people or the product developers sitting in the boardroom or in the lab. It's with the consumer. What does the consumer want? It is in starting at that point and getting an understanding of what the key issues are to the consumer, how the consumer wants those key issues resolved, that you now come to the boardroom and design products that respond to those desires of the consumer. And then we find a way of packaging it out and getting them to understand that this is the solution, this is what you asked for, this is what you have, and still take feedback from them in how to fine-tune that product. That's what we do in the private sector. And it ought to be, and indeed it is the same in the public sector or in the political space. First of all, what are the issues that matter to the people? How do they want these issues resolved? Else you can sit in the boardroom and come up with a manifesto or a platform that doesn't make sense to the people or doesn't respond to any of the people's challenges or needs. You can dream up fanciful ideas as a politician that really don't respond to what the people's heartbeat is. So it starts with the people. What do they need? What are their key issues? What are the feasible things, looking at the fiscal envelope that we have, that we can really do? And then we convert those into products or services or promises or platforms and sell it to them. If we have a social contract with them, make sure we deliver. And while we are delivering, continue to engage through town hall meetings, policy summits, get feedback, and be a listening brand. Again, the same conversation about the private sector is the same thing. Be a listening brand out there so that the people can say, nice idea, but we don't like this particular idea. Nice project, but it's utterly useless. And public practitioners or politicians should not be shy to say, we brought you this, you say it's lousy, we're taking it off the table and replacing with something. In Ghana, quite recently, we introduced what we call the luxury vehicle tax. And we went out to the people and sold it as best as we could. And the people, after a while, told us that this is a very bad idea. We don't want it. And we had to go back to Parliament and say, this is the product that we thought will solve a particular problem, and you have given us feedback, and we're listening. So it's in that same exercise of engagement that you have the people speaking and being heard, and their views being factored into the policy and programs of government.
Ibim, and this question goes for both of you, but I'll start with her. Just buttressing on what you said something earlier that it's not what you sell, but it's what the people are buying. And you've also said again that it starts with the consumers, which are the people. Now, African politicians in general sell a very beautiful product to you and make very lofty promises. And when they do not deliver and you complain, half the time nobody listens. So the feedback you're asking that people take, Ibim, we hardly see that happen in Africa. Yes, maybe a few governments come and go who maybe listen once in a while, but they literally do what they want to do and not necessarily minding what the people really want.
And yes and no. Why do I say yes and no? Again, it begins from when you even start designing what you want the people to have. We're fond of doing these opinion polls when we want to go for elections. And that just, in the last about 5-8 years, you find that African governments go ahead and do the opinion polls. What are the people looking for? What do they want? Sometimes frames the messaging. But then the problem is, right after elections and swearing in, between the fact that the person who did the poll is no longer around to remind them of what the poll says, or the fact that the main actors, again, are not in the room when policy decisions are being taken, sometimes what the people really yearn for gets to get the short shrift. However, the fact again remains that government more and more has to be about participation. And governments across Africa are beginning to see that if they do not allow the people participate and they do not engage with the people, they will invariably be shown the door out. Public communication experts, or those who manage government communications, need to understand this reality and share it with the governments that they work for. Because the truth of the matter is that it's not going to be possible for people to continue to hold the shorter end of the stick all the time. Mm-hmm. And when they do not see a government that appears to be listening and responding, they will believe every other narrative that the opposition throws out. So the thing you must do if you're the government in power or if you're the person managing the communication is to be seen to be listening. And that's a critical point, to be seen to be listening.
Okay. Now, he also said that you have to be a listening brand. But again, I won't sound like a broken record. African governments have somewhat developed a thick skin. Hence the reason why we're seeing more and more protests in Africa, because the traditional means of communicating to our governments have somewhat been shut down. So you see people hitting the streets more often. And then that also, which is a fundamental human right, is being clamped down on. So communication has broken down. And I'm wondering, why is this?
If I may, I would rather want to sound like a broken record in the sense that, you see, you can't really go away from the basics. If you do not understand that reputation management, communication management, relating to the public and stakeholders is at the heart of the entire enterprise. That's when you get into this fix where after the election and the swearing in, we throw the communication people away, and we find some new group of people to design policy and to, decide where the money goes. If you have that at the center of your scope, you would ensure that the communication people are in the thick of things. What that will do for you will give you the cheapest sort of feedback that you require, or barometer that you require on your entire governance exercise, because they would, through the same means, funnel back to you that this is what the people think about this particular policy or this particular program. At my Ministry of Information, for example, we have what we call the monthly perception tracker, where we have hired a professional agency that on a monthly basis tracks what the general public thinks about this or that or those. And we're able to go back to the very top with the hard data and say, sir, this is what the people think of this. This is what the people expect us to do on this matter. This is what the people think of that. We've got to continue with this particular matter. This is where our opportunities are to drum home our message some more and to amplify our story. So as we recognize that governance and politics, and indeed the entire enterprise, whether it's corporate or public, is about the consumer. If it's about the consumer, the bridge between the consumer and the entity are the PR people. You can't keep them out of the boardroom, keep them down the line, not fund or resource their exercises. If they come back to you and they say that they need X to do a poll every Y to give you the data, you can't say, no, we are pumping all our money into infrastructure or some other projects and leave them out, because you will not hear or see or identify what your consumers are thinking and have that looped back to inform, is it your product, is it your... It comes back to the basics. Keep them involved and let them be the bridge between you and your customers.
All right, we have questions.
If I may just interject, and this is to say, so both of us are talking about what should happen, the professional thing to do. Oftentimes, you then find that governments in Africa want people who will make sufficient noise to drown the noise. So there's a lot of noise coming from the opposition or from other people, and there's too many alternative facts. So what do? I hire a loudspeaker.
My own noisemaker.
So that I can drown the noise.
Yeah.
Now that's the biggest mistake in public communications, because you then have a cacophony of noises. And the reality is, because your own noisemaker is a noisemaker from government, and is not addressing the issues, and is not relating it to what the people had asked for, what you then have is a gabble of noises, and nobody will take your noise seriously. And I think that that is at the heart of the matter. African governments need to understand this. It's not about who shouts the loudest. It's about who is able to actually, again, we're back to the issue of accuracy and truth and fact.
Okay. That's the basis. We have some questions. Can we take questions?
Okay. We'll start with the lady here.
My name is Tolu Olokpeamusu. I would like to drop a comment. All right. I did a paper on community radio, a catalyst for social development, and I used community radio. Now, I've come to realize that social media isn't necessarily the place where we get the core desires, the core issues of the people. Yeah, it's the loudest, but when you want to get the core issues people are dealing with in societies, it goes back to the rural space. Now, if we are communicators and we really want to get our word out there, we could also be facilitators. Now, what do I mean by that? What we can do is, in getting our communicated work out there, you allow the people themselves generate the meaning of what you're trying to communicate. From there, they get the essence of what you're saying. So, participatory learning approach, they dig out the issues by themselves. Invariably, you've communicated what you want to get out there, but they identified it by themselves.
Thank you. That was a contribution. Question?
Right. My name is Yao Kuono from Ghana. So I know that managing government communication can be a really complex business. How do you ensure that different principals within government are communicating the same message or are in sync? And how do you make sure, or how do you bring those who deviate from that standard messaging back to track? I believe that both of you would have perspectives on it, and it will be great to learn that from you.
So synergy, which sometimes is a problem in government, you know, the different tiers of government.
Yes, so one of the things to understand in public communication is that communication must stay in one room. The reason that is important, and again, that's where the role of the Ministry of Information comes in, where people need to understand So it starts from the president understanding and letting cabinet members understand that everybody cannot be talking for government. It's important because the messaging has to be clear. And there's one person whose job it is to decide what that message is, how that message should go out, through which channels the message should go for. It doesn't always work. Happy to hear their voices, and they will cause a problem sometimes. When they cause the problem, they would expect the Ministry of Information to clean up. So it happens. But the real thing to do is to ensure that you're constantly, if you're the person in charge of managing government communication, constantly reaching out to your colleagues and saying, so what happened this week, in the Ministry of Health or in the Ministry of it's a bit extra work, but it helps because you're able again to proactively put out that story on their behalf. I know that in Nigeria, I don't know how it works in Ghana, there are information officers in each ministry. But unfortunately, all the time, ministers still go ahead and have their own special media aides who make the job of the person whose job it is difficult. And so you hear a special media aide.
Are you talking of Ghana or Nigeria?
Nigeria, please. This is Nigeria.
Really?
And the special media aide just goes on TV or goes on radio and shoots his mouth, and then you're sitting and you're watching TV and you're saying, what just happened? And then you quickly are calling the station and say, listen. We have
that guy off the air.
So it's just trying to ensure the discipline, and really the head of government has that responsibility of ensuring that that discipline is maintained.
And I think in Ghana now what we're trying to do is to develop a common platform that allows the various arms of government to share information which we can then craft into narratives that everybody must understand that this is the official government position on this matter. And this is how, therefore, we go about to communicate it. Your personal opinion really is not the most important thing at this point in time. We are running an enterprise, and this is the corporate approach to things. But that also means that the central government must know. So how call things in public. If it's an organization with 45 people and 17 branches, it's a bit different. If you're running a government with 600 public institutions, etc., getting the government to know what everybody's doing in their own corner is a big thing. So that's one. But the second thing, which I think we haven't also done very well at, is ensuring that people who create PR nightmares for us are made to understand that the public perception of us sometimes is even more important than the substantive work that we are doing. Exactly. And so if you go out there and you create PR nightmares for us, there must be severe consequences as a deterrent to anybody else in the system, because if we don't, then he shoots off his mouth, next week there's a problem, the following week, he's in queue, the third week, all that we are doing won't matter. Yeah. And so I think that's something that we all have to do a bit better at.
So lots of damage control happens instead of work. Any more questions?
I think mine is more a comment than a question. I'm really impressed by the two panelists with the depth of knowledge that is coming out from the two of you is really, really, really incredible. And importantly, coming from South Africa, and I'm sure, Honorable Minister, you're quite aware of some of the political crises that we're going through right now with our presidential campaign leaks and all manner of things. It's so refreshing to witness that a country can actually appoint, elect a minister that has the depth of knowledge in the sector and in the industry that you have. It's very apparent in the way you answer the questions. There's detail, there's understanding, there's there's just a clarity of role, and I think that it's something that us as other countries on the continent can learn from. And when we have this, I'm not going to say if, Perez, when we have this next year, I certainly would like to propose that, and I'll write it very well, it'll be packaged very well, but I propose that maybe we have a face-off between some of the communications ministers from some of the countries, so that we can all have best practice.
Okay, Wendy's about to set some fire on the continent.
That's some good fire.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My name is Francis from Kenya, and I am not in communication. I am in tourism technology. And you might be wondering, what is a tourism guy doing in a communication forum? The reason why I'm here is because there is a story that needs to be told in Africa, especially when it comes to tourism. We are positioning ourselves in the digital economy as Africa. And the data economy is really growing every day. But if you look at Africa, we're losing so much of our data outside there. So the question is, how do we help from communication aspect? How do we tell this story? We have the content, yes, but can you help us tell the story out there? Thank you.
I'm not sure I got the question.
That there's good tourism potential, but it's not being well articulated to fuel that potential, and you're wondering how it can be done. Okay.
Okay, so there is one question at the back, and that is the last question as well. The lady, yeah, she's been put it up her hand.
Good afternoon. I'm Kenti Stikolo from Kenya, a strategic PR and communication practitioner. It's really great to see the Minister for Information with us and sitting through the sessions. And your information about how government should actually communicate and how our communicators should is very, very clear. However, you mentioned, and correctly, that we need the communicators to be on the table. That means at government level, we need to have them at the table. How can we make this happen? That is the challenge we have, because it's not just about government. Even at corporate level, we are talking about it in this forum. The question is, how shall we get the communicators to be on the table where decisions are being made?
Well, I guess we have a very good example. The Honorable Minister is already at the table, meaning there is an opportunity for us to get at the table. Okay, one last question, and we will wrap up this session before going on to lunch.
Thank you. I'm very impressed by the knowledge with which the minister comes with. And I'm from Uganda. I'm Agi Patricia Turomwe, a PR specialist. I would like to pose my question to the Honorable Minister. How do we, experts, align well our goals or roles in PR or communications amidst all the difficulty that comes with practicing without alienating our principles? I'll just give you context. In Uganda, our president doesn't believe in PR, and this has gone on traditional and modern channels of communications. Him saying he thinks it's all propaganda. He wants him to be himself, and he doesn't want any PR. So you see that the perception that PR has in Uganda is not the best. And then Uganda has 41 million people, and 44% of these are internet users, right? So recently there was a tax, over-the-top tax, that was imposed directly to the consumers, impeding communication. So how do we go about this?
Thank you, and you can respond.
Well, I'll give it a try. A few tough questions, I'll give it a try. I think there needs to be a paradigm shift. There's this whole debate about form over substance or substance over form, or a good balance of both. And I think for many of our African politicians and governments and leaders, the thinking is that it's a matter of substance over form. It ought to be substance over form. And so for many of them, they believe, why are we spending, or why should we spend X amount of money on PR? Let's just do the work. But I think we need a paradigm shift that gets people to understand that actually what is happening, or what needs to happen, is that the consumer, the people out there, need to believe in a brand or a product, to buy it, and to keep it in power. If you're running a democracy like what we're all hoping to do in Africa, and it's really based on people going to the ballot to cast a vote, and hopefully to renew it the next time, then you must be clear on, first of all, what they want and how we've positioned our brand to respond to that, how we are delivering on that and responding to their concerns. I had coffee during this break, and I requested for a particular brand of coffee. Why? Because somehow it has been told to me to answer something on my taste bud. And so what I'm actually buying, or what I'm actually doing, is putting my purchase decision behind the perception I have of the various coffee brands. And that's the same thing that there is in governance or politics. So we have to get that paradigm shift to get our bosses to understand that it really doesn't matter what else you think, the paradigm you have about Africa or the globe or wherever. What really matters is how we get the consumer out there to know that these are the things that are important to me. There's a brand that responds to these things in a manner I'm comfortable with, and I want to retain that. And if you're doing that, you will not think that PR is just propaganda or just something that just wastes money out there. On the question of getting the communicators at the table, I think it's the same thing. If you have this at the back of your mind, you will have the communications people right at the cabinet table. Thankfully for us in Ghana, I sit in cabinet. So even at the time when the government is considering the decision, when the document is secret and it's being considered, you have an opportunity to weigh in and say X or Y or Z. I have had opportunity to raise questions about bills that were even to be tabled, and the president has said, Minister, respond to what the information minister is saying, because that is the PR nightmare we're going to face, or the nightmare within the stakeholder community. And sometimes, you know, the minister would have to pull the bill back to go and do some more consultation, because at the end of the day, the president gets it quite clearly, that it's about the consumers and their perception of the brand. And if they don't believe that this brand answers my question in a particular way, they will not retain you know, that particular brand. And then on tourism, I think we have more than enough professionals here in this room. You have a product that has a potential market, and what you're looking to do is to connect the two. And the people who know how to do it best are right here in this room. I'm sure a few consulting contracts can follow after this afternoon's engagement.
You want to say something?
Well, I think that we've dealt with the issues, but the most important thing is to understand that these days, communication experts do sit at the table. And that's why the ministers of information are usually at the table. The question is whether, going forward, and again, it's back to who is the boss. The things we hear from, or I hear from the minister in Ghana, suggest that the president insists that responses are made. Now, you don't always have that happen. You sit in cabinet and you're saying, I'm sorry, there appears to be a problem with XYZ policy. And except the man at the head gives you a backing, you will have a colleague in cabinet who's saying, Minister of Information, why are you always against, you know, and sometimes, I mean, people have asked me, on whose side are you? You know, and I say to them, when I sit in cabinet, I'm on the side of the people. When I step out of cabinet, I'm on your side. And that's what people need to understand.
Interesting. I want to say thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Boone. Thank you so much. Perez?
Thank you for prompting Perez. Another round of applause for our distinguished panelists, and of course, ever gorgeous Marianne Okon for moderating the session. Very insightful, very educating, and of course, it highlighted some fundamental principles that we all as communicators must imbibe, and it's about being accurate, being intentional, and more importantly, getting some things done. And just buttressing the fact that the Minister of Information from the Republic of Ghana is a good testament that we can get the right people on the seat at the table to really engage proactively with the governments of the day. And of course, in championing the narrative of a new Africa that we all dream and hope for, we will continue to speak for Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so much. Right, just so you know, tomorrow being the third and final day of the Global Africa Forum on Communications, GAFCON, it's going to be a packed and exciting session
or sessions, actually, series of sessions. And I know a lot of us have been looking forward to a particular one, which is in and around the age of social media. The rage of social media. So age and rage actually kind of go together. So we are going to be having that and many more conversations in and around. So it's going to be quite a packed number of sessions tomorrow. And more importantly, as we did announce yesterday, we have the pleasure of joining 1000 Hills Distilleries to a very lovely cocktail party being put together by 1000 Hills Distilleries on behalf of the conference. Just to say thank you to everyone for being a part of this remarkable maiden edition of the GAFCOM. A round of applause once again, ladies and gentlemen. We will be communicating appropriately the details of the venue for the cocktail reception happening at 7 p.m. tomorrow. So technically, we'll be done officially from the conference, and everyone will have time to go back to their respective hotels or homes, wherever you are staying here in Rwanda, and you will be expected to come back to join us for the cocktail reception at 7 p.m. We will be communicating the details to you on the venue. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we will take a break for lunch. Lunch is served at the foyer. We will return for more conversations to wrap up day 2 after lunch. Thank you so much. And just to remind us that don't forget to tag us, hashtag Speak for Africa and hashtag GAFCOM 2019.
Happy Jamhuri.
Please put
Happy
up the
Jamhuri.
posts. And do feel free to network as well. It's an opportunity to interact and collaborate. Speak for Africa.
It's Exmalia from Cameroon.
Hello, my name is Efia from Ghana.
And for us, Christmas is
The time to come together and reflect upon all the things that happened during the year,
getting together with the family
to make the best out of what we can for the next year coming.
and staying with the loved ones.
I just want to wish everybody a Merry, Merry Christmas.
God bless.
On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a vuvuzela and a dashiki.
On the second day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 2 plates of unkwabi and a partridge in a pear tree. On the third day of Christmas, my true love gave to me sauce mulmulda, 2 plates of unkwabi and a partridge in a pear tree.
Attends, ça c'est quoi ça? Nous on n'est pas habitués à ça quoi. Noël, nous on ne chante pas comme ça. C'est quoi ces histoires là?
On the fourth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 4 crested crayons,
Sauce mulmulda, 2 plates of unkwabi and a partridge in a pear tree.
On the fifth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 5 fresh gold chains.
4 pássaros coloridos. Sauce mulmulda, 2 plates of unkwabi.